So what I find interesting about this is, I know one of the tactics of the Chinese Communist Party is often to, play off any kind of dissent against local governments. This happened a lot in COVID in particular. Like, if there's a problem, blame the local authorities. It has nothing to do with the Communist Party itself, fundamentally, or especially the central government. And so sort of from what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that largely it seems like the dissent in China is not focused directly at the Chinese Communist Party itself or the central government. It tends to be much smaller or more local in scale.
This is so as a very brief answer, I would say yes. That's a relatively accurate takeaway. But I would substitute Communist Party or the one-party regime for the central government. So it's rare that protests are directed at the central government. We've coded something like 2 to 3% of the dissent events that we've collected are directed at the central government, the targeted central government. So it's pretty rare, but it does exist. Local government or some local government body, and then private companies make up the majority of the targets. But the reason I say it's complex, or the longer answer to this question, is that while people aren't explicitly invoking the Communist Party as a target, or often it does happen, but it's not happening often, or they're invoking the one-party regime. It is a one-party state, even at the local level. So we can interpret from the reaction of the government that even though the target is often local actors or local officials, they still sense it as a threat. Otherwise, we wouldn't see so much repression. We've recorded direct evidence of repression in 1 out of every 4 dissent cases. We're relatively confident that it's even a higher proportion than that because of just how these cases and what we know about the way that police show up at the scenes and how they generally treat protesters. But we only code for repression when there's direct evidence of it. We can actually show through pictures or video or some sort of testimony or post. So we found in 1 out of 4 cases there's repression, which is still pretty high.
That actually seems surprisingly low because I would think that there'd be crackdowns. But maybe what's happening is not that the police are coming on scene. It might be they're using other tactics like visiting protesters' homes later. Are you seeing that kind of thing, or are you not recording it?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a gap, a recording gap for us because we're not following. There's so many cases. There's hundreds of cases that we're not following and sort of tracking each one over time. Usually, what we're getting is snapshots in time. And I mean, you said that it seems like it's not that high. I think that's what I mean by we know from generally the pattern of these protests and the way that authorities react that even though we're only seeing a few seconds of the event, because it's big enough, because it's making noise in a public place, we can kind of estimate what's going to happen after that snapshot. But it just happens to be that nobody reports it. We didn't find anybody reporting about what happened after. We only got that snapshot. So going back to the previous issue, though, so even though the target is local government and private companies most of the time, this is being repressed because of the sort of a larger structural issue that collective action itself, even when the target is not the one-party regime per se, is seen as a threat. Collective action is and people organizing to protest against any authority or any power is apparently perceived as a threat. Otherwise, we wouldn't see systematic repression, systematic efforts to keep this information from getting out, or from people recording and putting it online and sharing it with one another, or organizing across borders or organizing across issues and events. There wouldn't be such efforts to try to prevent these things if it wasn't perceived as a threat. So that's a really long way of saying, while we're coding at a very sort of micro level, and we're coding and we're analyzing that these events are usually focused on local government and private companies, The Communist Party definitely perceives most of these collective actions as instability. Otherwise, they wouldn't go to such efforts to try to prevent and repress them on a regular basis.
Can you talk about what the success rate of these protests are? Because I'm just thinking through, like, if repression, if you know as a protester that there's probably going to be consequences to your protest, but there's still enough of an incentive to do it.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons that we wanted to track concessions for this very reason, to try to understand the successes that people are having, and not only how often are they having those successes, but what do they look like. It's been somewhat expectedly, it's been a struggle only because concessions don't usually happen at the point of protest. They're not something that you see in the direct evidence. They often happen after the local government or even the national government, if there's a lot of protests about a particular issue, are making some announcement or change in policy maybe days or weeks after, and it was directly influenced by a protest or a number of protests. But we can't make that connection all the time directly, or we don't see that action all the time. So it's a little bit more difficult to draw direct lines between one action and concessions. We've been able to, despite that, we've been able to record concessions in. I'd have to look up the stats. It's off the top of my head. I think it's something like 5% to 10% of cases. So it's not nothing. But the reason that it's small is, again, because of this evidence issue. There's probably the rate of concessions is probably higher, but we can't see it as much. The types of concessions that we're seeing really depend on the case. So for COVID, we talked a moment ago about COVID-related protests. Often people are getting a sum of what they want from these actions. So if it's an issue with movement restrictions or just a really draconian lockdown, we've seen lots of cases where the local government within a few days loosens up those restrictions, and it's pretty clearly a reaction to public discontent. So that's for COVID-related actions. For housing, it's really hard to draw a direct line because it's such a systematic issue that I was just talking about, sort of an ongoing multi-year issue of companies using a certain model to fund housing projects. But what we saw was what seemed to be the result of this accumulated protest. Even though they aren't a concerted sort of organized movement, they've almost had the impact of a movement by getting the government to at least verbally make certain commitments. The central government said that it was going to provide additional liquidity to some of the developing, to some of the real estate companies, which is kind of counters what it had previously said, that it was going to let some of these companies fail if they have too much debt, that it's irresponsible business practices. So, we did see a change in at least the attitude of the government. Whether or not it has any actual effect on stalled housing and it leads to less of this structural issue, it remains to be seen. We still see a lot up to now. We still see a ton of housing related protests. So it's certainly not something that has been solved. We do see concessions.